Looking back now, I should have noticed the signs. The way the streetlights flickered as I drove beneath them, how the radio kept cutting to static even though I'd just replaced the antenna, and that bizarre moment when my phone showed 11:47 p.m. for what felt like 5 straight minutes. But I was too exhausted from my 12-hour shift at Memorial Hospital to pay attention to anything except the wet road ahead and the promise of my warm bed waiting at home. The rain had started around 10 p.m., one of those autumn downpours that turns the world into a blur of reflected lights and shadow. My windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the deluge, and I had to lean forward in my seat, squinting to make out the yellow lines on the road. My scrub still smelled like antiseptic and coffee, reminders of a particularly challenging night in the ER, 3 cardiac arrests, 1 major car accident, and a steady stream of flu cases had left me drained. I remember thinking about how I needed to call my mom the next day. It was her birthday coming up, and I hadn't bought her gift yet. It's strange, the mundane thoughts that run through your mind in the moments before everything changes, before your life splits definitively into before and after. The semi-truck appeared out of nowhere. 1 second the road ahead was clear, and the next, there was a wall of metal and lights jackknifing across both lanes. The driver must have hit a slick patch of road. I would later learn he'd been driving for 14 hours straight, pushing past legal limits to meet a deadline. His exhaustion and the rain proved to be a fatal combination. Time did that thing they always talk about in movies. It slowed down until each moment stretched out like pulled taffy. I saw the truck's headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt, creating halos that reminded me of the diagrams of light diffraction I'd studied in physics class. I heard the sound of tires struggling for grip on wet pavement, a high-pitched squeal that seemed to go on forever. I felt my hands turn the steering wheel, my foot slam the brake pedal through the floor. It wasn't enough. The impact wasn't what I expected. There was no dramatic movie-style explosion, no flying through the windshield. Instead, there was a sound like the end of the world, a massive crunch of metal meeting metal at speeds physics hadn't designed them for. My little Honda might as well have been a soda can meeting a sledgehammer. The airbag deployed with a force that felt like being punched in the face by a heavyweight boxer. My head snapped back, then forward, then everything started to spin. The world became a kaleidoscope of broken glass, twisted metal, and those damn headlights that wouldn't stop spinning. I remember 3 distinct sensations in those final moments of consciousness. The taste of blood in my mouth, I'd bitten my tongue, the smell of burning rubber and hot metal, and the peculiar thought that I'd left my favorite coffee mug unwashed in the break room sink at work. Then everything went black, but that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning, because what happened next would make me question everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what waits for us on the other side. What I experienced in those 6 minutes when my heart stopped beating, I'm still trying to make sense of it, but I need to share it. People need to know the truth. They need to know that sometimes, when the light calls to you, the best thing you can do is turn away and run. The transition from living to whatever I was didn't happen instantly. It was like slowly surfacing from a deep pool of black water, becoming aware in layers. The first thing I noticed was the absence of pain. Considering that my body had just been in a catastrophic collision, this should have been my first clue that something was very wrong. I opened my eyes, or at least I thought I did, to find myself hovering about 10 feet above the crash scene. The rain was still falling, but it passed right through me as if I wasn't there. Below, a chaotic scene was unfolding with the surreal quality of a silent film. Emergency vehicles had already arrived, their red and blue lights painting everything in alternating colors that seemed too vivid, too intense. I watched the paramedics work on my body with detached fascination. From my vantage point, I could see myself crumpled in the driver's seat, blood trickling from a gash on my forehead. My skin was already taking on a grayish tinge that I recognized from my years working in the ER. It was the color of people hovering between life and death. One of the paramedics was calling out vitals. BP dropping, pulse thready, we're losing her. Their voices sounded muffled, like they were speaking underwater. I tried to call out, to tell them I was right here, but no sound came from my non-existent mouth. That's when I noticed the first, truly strange thing. One of the paramedics, a man with graying temples and kind eyes, had a watch on his wrist. The face of it was clearly visible in the flashing lights, and it was frozen at 11:47 p.m. At first, I thought it must be broken, but then I noticed that the second hand was moving, backward, tick, 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 each movement sending little ripples through the air like stones dropped in a pond. The rain had taken on an odd quality too. Each droplet seemed to contain tiny galaxies, swirling with points of light that shouldn't have been there. When they hit the ground, they left momentary impressions that glowed with a faint phosphorescence before fading away. I tried to look away from my broken body below, but my attention was drawn to a dark figure standing at the edge of the scene. It wasn't a paramedic or a police officer. It was too tall, too still. It stood perfectly motionless in the rain, and though I couldn't see a face beneath its hood, I knew it was watching me, not my body being worked on by the paramedics, but me floating above it all. The figure raised what might have been an arm, and I felt a pull upward. The crash scene began to recede below me, growing smaller and smaller. I wanted to resist, to stay close to my body, but the force drawing me upward was irresistible. As I ascended, I passed through the rain clouds, which felt like moving through layers of cold silk. Above them, the night sky wasn't what it should have been. Instead of stars, I saw vast geometric patterns stretching into infinity, pulsing with a light that seemed to have awareness. They were beautiful in a way that made my consciousness recoil, too perfect and precise to have occurred naturally. The higher I rose, the more the familiar world fell away. Earth itself became a distant blue marble, then disappeared entirely. I was moving through something else now, something that existed between spaces. Sheets of what looked like crystalline light surrounded me, each one containing fragments of different realities, glimpses of places and things that shouldn't exist. In one sheet, I saw a city made entirely of shifting shadows. In another, a garden where the flowers were composed of pure sound. My human mind struggled to process what I was seeing, trying to translate impossible geometries and colors that had no names into something I could understand. But through it all, that dark figure remained constant, always just at the edge of my vision, guiding my ascent towards something that waited above, something that pulsed with a light that promised peace, promised rest, promised everything I had ever wanted. I didn't know then that I was being led into a trap. I didn't realize that the true horror was still to come. The journey upward became increasingly strange. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I could have been traveling for minutes or millennia. The crystalline sheets of light grew more frequent, pressing closer, their contents more bizarre and unsettling. In one, I saw myself at different ages, but each version had something subtly wrong. Eyes too large, fingers too long, smiles that stretched beyond the confines of human anatomy. The sensation of movement changed. Instead of rising, it felt like reality itself was folding around me. Colors began to bleed into one another, creating new shades that my mind struggled to process. There was a deep purple that seemed to scream, and a blue that tasted like childhood memories. Through it all, that dark figure remained my constant companion, always keeping pace. I began to notice things about it that I hadn't before. Its movements were too smooth, like animation with missing frames. When it turned what I assumed was its head, the motion left trailing after images in the air, each one slightly different from the last. Then came the voices. At first, they were barely whispers, like radio stations bleeding into each other. I caught fragments of conversations, some in languages I'd never heard, others in voices I recognized. My dead grandfather talking about his garden, my childhood best friend who died in high school, laughing about a joke we'd shared. Each sound pulled at something deep inside me, drawing me further upward. The crystalline sheets began to pulse in rhythm with the voices, creating a hypnotic pattern that made it difficult to think clearly. I found myself passing through layers of existence that seemed to grow progressively more real than what I'd known on Earth. Our physical reality began to feel like a crude sketch compared to the complexity of what I was experiencing. Suddenly, everything stopped. The dark figure had halted its ascent, and I felt myself hanging in a space between spaces. Around us, the crystalline sheets had formed a kind of sphere, their surfaces now showing what looked like memories. Not just mine, but others too. I saw countless lives, countless deaths, all bleeding into one another. The figure turned to me fully for the first time. Where a face should have been, there was a swirling void that seemed to draw in light itself. When it spoke, its voice was like 1,000 whispers layered over each other. Are you ready to see? I hadn't been able to speak since leaving my body, but here, in this place, I found I could form words with my thoughts. See what? I asked. What you've been seeking, what all souls seek. The crystalline sphere began to rotate around us, moving faster and faster until the images blurred into a solid wall of light. The void where the figure's face should have been began to glow with a brilliant white radiance that promised peace, joy, and reunion with everything I'd ever lost. I felt myself drawn toward that light, every fiber of my being yearning to merge with it. This, I thought, must be heaven. This must be what everyone who's had a near-death experience was talking about. The peace that passes all understanding. But as I moved closer to that brilliant glow, something deep inside me, some primitive instinct that predated consciousness itself, began to scream in warning, because in that perfect light, for just a fraction of a second, I saw something move, something that should not have been there, something that smiled with too many teeth. The light enveloped me completely, and for a moment all my doubts were washed away in a flood of pure bliss. I found myself standing in what appeared to be a vast space of pristine white, stretching infinitely in all directions. The air, if it could be called that, felt thick with peace and tranquility. Every worry, every fear, every painful memory seemed to dissolve. And then I saw them. My grandfather was the first to approach, looking exactly as he had before cancer ravaged his body. He wore his favorite flannel shirt and that crooked smile I'd missed so much. Behind him came others. My childhood best friend Jack, still 16 and wearing his football jersey. My Aunt Rose, her face unlined by the strokes that had taken her. Even my first dog Buddy, bounding toward me with the energy of his puppy days. We've been waiting for you, my grandfather said, opening his arms for a hug. His voice was perfect, that deep, warm rumble that used to make me feel so safe. I stepped into his embrace, and for a moment, everything felt right. But only for a moment. His hug was too tight, the pressure increasing until it should have been painful, except I felt no pain, just the wrongness of it. When he finally released me, his smile had grown slightly wider than before, a bit too wide for his face. Isn't it wonderful here? Jack asked, but his voice had an echo to it, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. No more suffering, no more loss, just peace forever and ever and ever and ever. His words began to loop like a scratched record. I took a step back, really looking at my surroundings for the first time. The white space wasn't empty as I'd initially thought. There were structures in the distance, but they seemed to shift when viewed directly. Buildings that folded in on themselves in impossible ways, trees that grew upside down and sideways simultaneously, paths that led everywhere and nowhere. The light that had seemed so comforting now felt harsh, like standing too close to a fluorescent bulb. It hummed at a frequency that made my non-existent teeth ache. And the peace felt artificial, like Novocaine numbing a rotting tooth. Don't you want to stay with us? Aunt Rose asked, reaching for my hand. Her fingers were just slightly too long, the joints bending in extra places. We can all be together, forever. As she spoke, I noticed her teeth were oddly translucent, like glass catching the light. Buddy, my beloved childhood dog, patted closer. His tail was wagging, but the motion was wrong. It moved in stops and starts, like animation at a low frame rate. When he opened his mouth to bark, I saw his tongue was covered in what looked like tiny, blinking eyes. This is heaven, my grandfather said, still smiling that too wide smile. This is what you've always wanted. But his voice had changed, taking on harmonics that no human throat could produce. Behind him, the others began to speak in unison, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of promises and pleading. Stay with us. Never be alone again. We love you so much. Forever and ever and ever. The white space flickered for a split second, like a glitch in a video game. In that instant, I saw what lay beneath the perfect surface, a writhing mass of shapes and angles that hurt my mind to perceive. The faces of my loved ones flickered too, their familiar features momentarily replaced by something else, something that wore their skin like ill-fitting masks. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go in this infinite white space. My grandfather's face began to stretch, his smile literally reaching his ears now, the skin pulling thin enough to see through. Jack's eyes had started to multiply, spreading across his face like drops of water on a hot skillet. Aunt Rose's fingers were growing longer, splitting at the tips like roots seeking soil. And still they smiled, still they promised love and peace and forever. But now I could hear what they weren't saying out loud. Under their words, almost below the threshold of perception, there was another voice, ancient, hungry, and very, very patient. It spoke in a language I'd never heard but somehow understood. Caught, finally caught. That was when I started noticing other things that were wrong. The white space had taken on a subtle yellowing at the edges, like old paper left in the sun. The air felt thicker, almost syrupy, and carried a faint scent that reminded me of hospital rooms where patients had passed away. That peculiar mix of antiseptic and decay. My loved ones had begun to move differently. Their gestures became puppet-like, as if invisible strings were jerking their limbs. When they walked, their feet didn't quite touch the ground. Instead, they hovered a fraction of an inch above it, leaving ripples in the surface like stones dropped in water. "Don't you remember all the good times?" My grandfather asked, his voice now layered with others speaking just slightly out of sync. His eyes had started to leak a silvery fluid that evaporated before it hit the ground, like when we used to go fishing at the lake. But as he spoke, the memory he referenced began playing out in the air between us, and it was wrong. In this version, the fish we caught had human teeth. The water ran red. The sky above was filled with twisted geometries that made my mind recoil. Or the time we won the championship game, Jack added, his multiple eyes blinking in random patterns. Behind him, that memory materialized too, but the football field was made of writhing shadows, and the cheering crowd had no faces. The pristine white walls began to crack, hairline fractures spreading like spider webs. Through them, I caught glimpses of what lay beyond, vast spaces filled with undulating masses of flesh and metal, bizarre architectures that defied physics, and things that moved in ways nothing should move. Aunt Rose's fingers had grown so long they dragged on the ground, leaving trails like snail slime that glowed with an inner light. "We have so many new memories to make," she said, her glass teeth tinkling like wind chimes as she spoke. The sound they made formed words in a language that made my soul want to shrivel up and hide. Buddy had started to unravel, his fur peeling away in strips to reveal not muscle and bone, but layers of shifting symbols that hurt to look at. His tail had multiplied into dozens, each moving to a different rhythm, creating patterns that seemed to hypnotize. The humming in the air had grown louder, becoming a discordant symphony of sounds that shouldn't exist together. I could hear children laughing, but the laughter was played backward. Church bells tolling underwater, the sound of colors screaming. "Stay," they all said in unison, their voices harmonizing in impossible ways. "Stay with us forever." As they spoke, their forms began to blur at the edges, bleeding into one another like watercolors in the rain. My grandfather's smile had wrapped completely around his head now, dividing it into two distinct sections that rotated in opposite directions. The white floor beneath my feet had become transparent in places, revealing vast distances below filled with swirling shapes that might have been bodies, might have been machines, might have been something else entirely. They moved with purpose, like blood cells in a vein, all flowing towards some central point I couldn't quite see. And throughout it all, that ancient voice had grown stronger, no longer hiding behind their words. "Feed us your memories, feed us your dreams, feed us your soul." The reality of my situation began to dawn on me with horrifying clarity. This wasn't heaven, this was something else. Something that fed on human souls by giving them exactly what they thought they wanted, keeping them docile while it slowly devoured their essence. And I was trapped here with them, The transformation happened suddenly, like a mask finally dropping away. The yellowish tinge in the air darkened to the color of infected wounds, and the humming became a roar of discordant frequencies. The pretense of heaven shattered completely, revealing the true nature of where I had been drawn. My grandfather's form split along the line of his wrapped-around smile, peeling open like a rotten fruit. Inside was a shifting mass of geometric patterns and eyes. Thousands of eyes, all different, all stolen from other souls trapped here before me. They blinked in sequences that formed mathematical equations too complex for human minds to comprehend. Jack's body had become a living fractal, constantly folding in on itself and expanding outward simultaneously. His multiple eyes had spread across his entire form, and each one showed a different memory from my life. But they were corrupted, twisted versions where every moment of joy had been turned into something horrific. Aunt Rose's elongated fingers had transformed into writhing tentacles made of what looked like liquid glass and static electricity. They reached for me, and where they touched the ground, reality itself cracked and bled a substance that moved against gravity, flowing upward to join the churning mass above. The thing that had been Buddy was now a moving portal, and opening into spaces that shouldn't exist. Through him, I could see vast chambers filled with countless other souls in various stages of consumption. Some still maintained human form, desperately clinging to their memories of life. Others had been reduced to pure energy, being slowly drained by the entities that had trapped them. The white space had completely given way to reveal our true location. A massive organic mechanical structure that defied comprehension. We were in something like a stomach, or perhaps a processing center. The walls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that I realized with horror were made up of compressed human faces, all silently screaming. "Now you see us as we are," the entities said in unison, their voices no longer pretending to be human. The sound was like glass breaking in reverse, like planets colliding in slow motion, like the death rattle of universes. "We are the collectors, the consumers, the ones who feast on what makes you human." They began to move toward me with their true forms revealed. My grandfather was a tower of twisted light and shadow, bending space around him as he moved. Jack had become a fractal hurricane of eyes and teeth and impossible angles. Aunt Rose's form suggested dimensions that human minds weren't meant to perceive. "We have fed on souls since the first spark of consciousness flickered in the universe," they explained. Their words appeared as burning symbols in the air, searing themselves into my mind. "Your species' concept of heaven makes such perfect bait. You want so badly to believe in a peaceful afterlife, in reunion with loved ones. Your desire blinds you to the truth until it's too late." The chamber began to contract around us, the walls of faces moaning in harmony. Above, that churning mass I'd glimpsed earlier descended closer, and I could now see it was composed of millions of partially digested souls, all swirling together in a torrent of stolen consciousness. "Your memories will be particularly delicious," the thing that had been my grandfather said, reaching for me with appendages made of crystallized time. "Your fear makes them so much sweeter." I tried to back away, but space itself had become fluid, non-linear. Every step seemed to bring them closer rather than creating distance. The air had become thick with floating symbols that looked like a combination of mathematical equations and ancient runes. They burned my eyes to look at, but I couldn't look away. "Listen," Jack's fractalized form sang, his voice splitting into 1,000 harmonics. "Listen to the others who came before you." And I could hear them, countless voices crying out from the swirling mass above. All those souls who had followed the light, who had believed they were going to heaven, only to end up here, being slowly consumed by these ancient, patient horrors. In that moment of absolute horror, something inside me snapped. Maybe it was my medical training kicking in, that instinct to fight against death no matter the odds. Or maybe it was something more primal, the basic human refusal to be prey. Whatever it was, it cut through my terror with crystal clarity. I had to escape. The entities sensed my change in consciousness. The thing that had been my grandfather let out a sound like breaking glass played through 1,000 churches' bell towers. The chamber began to contract faster, the faces in the walls screaming louder. "There is no escape," they said in unison. "No soul has ever escaped." But in saying that, they made their first mistake. They revealed that escape was possible, because why say something is impossible unless there's a chance it could happen? I looked up at the swirling mass of souls above me, really looked at it. In the chaos of tortured consciousness, I noticed something: patterns. The souls weren't just swirling randomly, they were flowing like water, and where there's flow, there must be an exit. I began to run, not with legs. I had no physical form here, but with pure will. The entities pursued me, their forms twisting through impossible geometries to try to cut off my path. Jack's fractal body exploded into 1,000 spinning eyes, each one trying to trap me with corrupted memories. Aunt Rose's glass tentacles whipped through the air, trying to snare my essence. The walls themselves tried to stop me, the faces reaching out with fingers made of solidified agony. The air became thick like molasses, each movement feeling like pushing through lead. Mathematical equations burned through the space around me, trying to rewrite the rules of reality to make escape impossible. But I had one advantage. I wasn't fully dead. Somewhere below, my body was being worked on by paramedics. I could feel it, a faint tug like a distant anchor in a storm. I just had to find my way back to it. I pushed upward, toward where the souls seemed to be flowing from. The entities howled, a sound that contained every nightmare ever dreamed. My grandfather's form unfolded into something with too many angles, trying to encircle me, but I had stopped seeing them as my loved ones. They were just things, parasites feeding on human consciousness. "Your soul is ours," they shrieked. "Your memories belong to us." In response, I did something desperate. I started forgetting, deliberately erasing memories, making myself less appetizing. I could feel pieces of my life slipping away. My first day of school, my 10th birthday, my college graduation. Each lost memory was like dropping ballast, allowing me to rise faster. The entities became frenzied, trying to catch the escaping memories. Their forms twisted and writhed, creating a kaleidoscope of horror around me, but their greed worked against them. They were so focused on catching the memories I was shedding that they didn't notice my true direction until it was too late. I found it, a point where the souls were being drawn in, which meant it had to also be a way out. It looked like a singularity made of broken mirror shards, each one reflecting a different reality. The entities realized what I was doing just as I reached it. "No," they screamed with a billion stolen voices. "If you go through there, you'll..." I didn't hear the rest. I plunged into the singularity, feeling my consciousness tear apart and rebuild itself 1,000 times per second. Reality bent and broke around me. I experienced death and rebirth simultaneously across infinite dimensions. And then I was falling. The return to my body felt like being struck by lightning. Every nerve ending fired at once, sending shockwaves of agony through my system. My lungs expanded violently as I gasped for air, and my heart thundered in my chest like it was trying to break free of my ribcage. "We've got her back," a voice shouted. "BP stabilizing, pulse returning to normal." The pain was excruciating, but it was real pain. Physical, comprehensible, human pain, not the reality-bending horror I'd just escaped. My eyes snapped open to see the inside of an ambulance, and the faces of paramedics looking down at me with a mixture of relief and amazement. "You were gone for 6 minutes, the older paramedic with gray temples said, his kind eyes wide with disbelief. "We were about to call it." He was real, solid, and his watch was working normally, the second hand moving forward as it should. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. One of the paramedics held an oxygen mask over my face, telling me not to try to talk. The ambulance sirens were wailing as we sped toward the hospital, and I had never been so grateful for that annoying sound. In the hospital, I drifted in and out of consciousness, but this was normal unconsciousness. No cosmic horrors, no geometries that shouldn't exist, just the soft darkness of human sleep. The doctors later told me I was incredibly lucky. Multiple broken ribs, a punctured lung, internal bleeding, but I had survived. They called it a miracle. If they only knew. Recovery was slow, and not just physically. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw fragments of what I'd experienced. The worst part was trying to determine what memories were real, and which ones I'd sacrificed during my escape. There were holes in my past now, blank spaces where memories should be. Some came back over time, like photographs slowly developing. Others remained lost, consumed by those entities in their false heaven. The doctors attributed my memory loss to head trauma from the accident. How could I tell them the truth? That I deliberately erased pieces of my life to escape being eternally digested by cosmic parasites, pretending to be deceased loved ones. They'd have admitted me to the psychiatric ward. But the memories of what I'd seen, of what existed beyond the veil of death, those stayed crystal clear. Every detail remained sharp, no matter how much I wished I could forget. The way my grandfather's face had split open to reveal those counting eyes, the geometric impossibility of Jack's fractalized form, the sound of a billion souls being slowly devoured. Most haunting of all was the knowledge that they were still there, still feeding, still luring souls into their trap with promises of peace and reunion. Every night in the hospital, I heard the metallic squeal of a flat line from some other room, and I wondered, did that soul fall for their trick? Are they now part of that swirling mass of consciousness, being slowly consumed by the things that wait behind the light? The doctors suggested therapy for PTSD from the accident. I went, but how could I explain what really traumatized me? Instead, I talked about the crash, the recovery, the physical pain. The therapist nodded sympathetically, never knowing that my true wounds weren't visible on any medical scan. 6 months after my accident, I returned to work at the hospital. Everything looked different now. The fluorescent lights in the hallways sometimes flickered in patterns that made my heart race. The beeping of medical equipment took on sinister undertones, especially during the quiet hours of night shifts. But the biggest change was how I dealt with death. The first time I lost a patient after returning to work, I found myself fighting not just to save their life, but to save their soul. As the heart monitor flatlined, I saw their consciousness begin to rise, that same upward drift I had experienced. And there, at the edge of my vision, was a familiar darkness, waiting to guide them up into that false light. I worked harder than I ever had before, refusing to lose patients if I could help it. My success rate with resuscitations became something of a legend in the ER. My colleagues attributed it to my own near-death experience, giving me new insight. They had no idea how right they were. I began researching near-death experiences obsessively during my off hours. Most accounts followed the familiar pattern: the tunnel, the light, the feelings of peace, seeing loved ones. But buried in online forums and obscure journals, I found others who had seen what I'd seen. They wrote in vague terms, afraid of being labeled crazy, but I recognized the truth hidden in their words. One account described angels with too many eyes. Another mentioned geometric shapes that ate memories. A woman in Idaho wrote about how her dead husband's smile went all wrong when she saw him in her near-death experience. Each story contained fragments of the horror I'd witnessed. I reached out to some of them anonymously. Most were too traumatized to discuss it, but a few responded. We formed a small online group, sharing our experiences in coded language. Together, we began to piece together a terrifying picture of what waited beyond death. The entities weren't confined to one location or one version of the afterlife. They adapted their lure to match their praise beliefs. Christians saw heaven and angels, Muslims saw paradise, Buddhists saw nirvana, but behind every version lurked the same hungry things, wearing whatever masks would be most convincing to their victims. But the more we discussed it, the more attention we seemed to attract. Members of our group reported strange phenomena. Their computers would display impossible symbols late at night. Their phones would record calls that consisted only of backwards singing. Several members disappeared entirely, their accounts going dark mid-conversation. Then the dreams started. Not normal nightmares, but shared visions. We all saw the same things: vast processing centers filled with trapped souls, machinery made of crystallized time and condensed consciousness, and always those patient, ancient entities overseeing it all. They knew we had escaped, they knew we were talking, and they were watching. My own dreams became more specific. I'd see my grandfather, his real face, not the twisted thing that had worn it, crying out in warning. I'd wake up to find my phone showing 11:47 p.m. regardless of the actual time. Sometimes, in mirrors or windows, I'd catch glimpses of floating equations written in that burning script I'd seen in their realm. The most disturbing development was what started happening around my patients who were close to death. I began seeing shadows gather, taking forms that nobody else seemed to notice. They would stand at the edges of rooms waiting, their not quite faces turned toward the dying. I'm writing this now because the world needs to know the truth. I've found evidence that these entities have been feeding on human souls for thousands of years. Ancient texts describe them, hidden in metaphors and religious parables. Cave paintings show beings with too many angles and eyes made of geometric shapes. Every culture has stories of trickster spirits that wear the faces of loved ones. My hands are shaking as I type this. Strange symbols keep appearing and disappearing on my screen, and I know they're watching me write. But they can't stop me, not anymore. I've learned their weaknesses, their limitations. They can only take souls that go willingly, that believe their illusions. That's why the disguise of heaven is so important to them. Last week I lost another member of our research group. Tom had been studying the mathematical patterns in near-death experiences when his house caught fire. The official report said he fell asleep with a cigarette, but he didn't smoke. The firefighters described finding impossible geometries burned into his walls, and his computer had melted into shapes they couldn't explain. Before he died, Tom sent me his research. He'd discovered something crucial, a pattern in the way these entities operate. They're bound by rules, ancient laws that even they must follow. The false heaven isn't just a lure, it's the only way they can feed. They need our willingness, our desire for the afterlife they're offering. Without that, they can't consume our souls. That's why I'm sharing this warning. If you ever find yourself in that place between life and death, be wary of the light. Be suspicious of loved ones who come to greet you. Look closely at the peace they're offering. Real peace doesn't hurt your eyes to look at. Real love doesn't come with geometry that breaks your mind. Most importantly, remember that you can escape. Your connection to life, no matter how faint, is your lifeline. They can't sever it themselves. You have to surrender it willingly. That's your power, that's your weapon. I know the risks of sharing this. Already my lights flicker in patterns that form words and languages that shouldn't exist. My phone shows calls from my dead grandfather's number. Last night, I saw Jack standing in my hallway, his face trying to fold into those familiar fractals. But I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen behind their masks. I know what they are, and knowledge is protection. They're ancient and powerful, yes, but they're also afraid. Afraid that humans will stop believing their lies. Afraid that souls will start slipping through their fingers. To anyone reading this who has seen what I've seen, you're not crazy, you're not alone, and you got away for a reason. Use that knowledge. Share it carefully, but share it. To everyone else, remember this story, not because it's scary, but because it might save you. Because someday, you might find yourself floating above your body, being drawn toward a beautiful light. You might see loved ones reaching out to welcome you home. And in that moment, you'll have a choice. Choose to look closer. Choose to question the angles of their smiles and the geometry of their embrace. Choose to remember that real love doesn't feel like razors behind your eyes. Choose to run. Because I know now that there is a real afterlife out there, somewhere beyond their false heaven. I've seen glimpses of it during my research. Moments of genuine peace that these entities can only poorly imitate. But to find it, we first have to reject their lies. I have to end this now. The shadows in my room are starting to move in ways shadows shouldn't, and my computer screen is filling with familiar equations. But I've said what needs to be said. Remember, if you see the light and it hurts to look at, turn away, run. Your soul depends on it.